Hey, fifth graders. All right, so this is going to be lesson two of unit 8, but first, obviously, let's go over the answers to lesson 1. So check understanding. President Theodore Roosevelt, A, was a progressive leader. Number 2, the Panama Canal was built to C, create a shortcut for ships between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Number 3, why were U.S. senators why were U.S. senators unwilling to allow the United States to join the League of Nations? The answer is again C. They thought the United States would be pulled into other countries' problems. Probably weren't wrong. Number 4, describe the kind of warfare shown in the photograph. What were the conditions like there? Okay, so that picture is a picture of trench warfare. And the conditions, you could write a lot of different things, but basically they were very dirty, and lots of diseases were spreading through the trenches. If you think about it, guys are getting shot, they're wounded, that sort of thing. They've got open cuts, and they're sitting there in the mud and the grossness. And I mean, I hate to say it, but there's not a lot of bathrooms around. They probably just had like little areas where, hey, go over here, here's a bucket, do what you got to do, kind of a thing, which is a nice recipe for spreading lots and lots of diseases, that sort of thing. Plus, if somebody is coughing, everybody around them is going to catch it because there's nowhere to go. So it was dirty, and there was lots of diseases, I think, is basically what you're looking at. Number 5, how did Americans at home help with the war effort? So first of all, women and minorities worked the jobs that the men, the soldiers, had given up to go fight. And also Americans who were at home tried to cut back on the amount of meat and sugar that they were eating. And basically they cut back on the amount of food that they were eating, so that the surplus could be sent to the soldiers. On the vocabulary page on the back side, there was 5 different words. Number 1, a reporter who found and wrote about dangerous working conditions was known as a muckraker. Number 2, a reform is a plan to improve people's lives. Number 3, the Treaty of Versailles, I know it looks like Versailles, but Versailles, is an agreement that ended World War I. Number 4, a progressive believes in social progress. And number 5, the League of Nations was an organization designed to allow countries to solve their problems peacefully. Now, a lot of you probably looked at League of Nations and were like, that sounds a lot like the United Nations. And it is. A lot of the things that they wanted in the League of Nations eventually show up in the League of Nations. So anyway, another note, and I'm going to be quick on this one, but I think a lot of our problems in like the Middle East and whatnot can also be traced back to the Treaty of Versailles. I didn't mention it last time, and I just can't help myself. But basically, one of the central powers, Turkey, basically, it was the Ottoman Empire, but it was basically Turkey. They controlled a lot of the Middle East. And so Britain sent some guys down there and basically convinced the Arabs, hey, start fighting against the Ottoman Empire. And then when we're done, you guys can, this will be your area. You do whatever you want with it, kind of a thing. And then it turns out that before, just a little bit, like basically once World War I was pretty much in the bag, and it was just a matter of like, when is Germany going to surrender? England and France got together and decided, hey, how are we going to divide up the Middle East amongst ourselves? Because we're going to control that area. And so that's what they did. And part of the Treaty of Versailles, I think, or maybe it was just a side agreement, but was this dividing up of the Middle East. And the Arabs did not appreciate it in the slightest. And I think maybe still a little bit don't trust the West in part because of that. So one more win for the Allies at the end of World War I, right? Okay. Anyway, all right. So we are lesson 2, which is good times, hard times. And here's the picture, which is kind of a cool one. So these are women marching for the right to vote. So, Part A, an important decade. During the Roaring Twenties, day-to-day life changed more quickly than ever before. Many people could afford exciting new products like cars. All of the spending caused big problems by the end of the decade. Um, I don't know if it's going to talk about it, but one other thing that happens here, it's not going to talk about it because they didn't realize how important it is. So at the end of World War I, so just before the 1920s, 1918, there was something that's kind of known as the Spanish flu, but it didn't actually originate in Spain. In fact, it's called the Spanish flu probably because Spain was the one who was reporting on it. Spain did not participate in World War I very much, and so consequently, I guess they had more time on their hands to report about flu season. This was a spectacularly awful flu, and probably at least in part because of World War One, where lots of people who normally wouldn't hang out together were mashed together. There was Americans and British and French and Russians were all kind of intermingled a little bit, and Germans and people like that. So consequently, this flu virus spread around the world. So we talked about at the end of the last one, 8.5 million soldiers died in World War I. This flu killed somewhere between 20 and 40 million people, I believe is what I just read. Yeah. More U.S. soldiers died from the 1918 flu than were killed in battle, or killed during the war. 40% of the U.S. Navy got it, and 36% of the Army got it. And it is estimated to have killed somewhere between 20 and 50 million people worldwide. And some people even think that it might be as much as 100 million, which would be 3% of the world's population at that time. What I find really interesting about this flu is that as this is raging on, the war is ending, people are coming home, and then all of a sudden everybody's getting sick. What they started doing is they started quarantining people, requiring them to wear masks. Men, weren't allowed to spit, which I think had more to do with obviously you don't spit because it spreads diseases. But I think spitting was maybe more of a problem back then, in part because of people chewing tobacco, things like that. But they closed down movie theaters, they closed down schools, businesses kind of closed their doors a little bit just to try and stop the spread of this flu. Sound familiar? Yeah, me too. I think that sounds exactly like what's happening here. But my point is that this was, I'm sure people at the time were like, this is like the end of the world. We just had this massive world war, and then now all of a sudden we've got this disease spreading everywhere. What are we going to do? But schools reopened, theaters reopened, life eventually went on. So, for those of you who are like wondering, is the world ever going to be the same? Yeah, it probably will. As much as we like to think that this is like unprecedented, the truth of the matter is that it's happened before and might happen again. Who knows? But the point is that, in 1918, we had a very similar thing happening, only way more deadly, probably at least partly because we didn't have the medicine that we do today. So they got back to normal. We will get back to normal. So off my soapbox, let's read the lesson. All right. The 1920s were a time of social change. Two of the most important changes during these years involved women and African Americans. Women's right to vote. Since the early 1800s, American women had been fighting for suffrage. This is one of your vocabulary words. It is not suffering, it's suffrage, which is the right to vote. Over the years, women such as Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt, had carried on the fight. The first state to grant women's suffrage was Wyoming in 1869, but a constitutional amendment did not come until 51 years later. After women's contributions during World War I, American lawmakers finally voted for women's suffrage. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The Great Migration. During the first decade of the 20th century, more than 1 million African Americans left the South. They wanted to escape racial violence and the Jim Crow laws that took away their voting rights. A boll weevil infestation of cotton crops uh, ruined the harvest, causing loss of jobs for field workers. Many African Americans moved to cities in the North and the Midwest. There, they found jobs in steel mills and automobile plants. They often faced discrimination there as well, but life there was generally safer and they were able to find jobs. This movement of African Americans from the South is called the Great Migration. During the Great Migration, Chicago's African American population doubled, Cleveland's tripled, and Detroit's became 6 times larger. Okay, the Roaring Twenties. Several important changes took place in the 1920s that affected the daily lives of most Americans. Many items we use every day were introduced during this time. Because life changed rapidly in exciting ways, the decade became known as the Roaring Twenties. Automobiles change America. During the 1920s, the automobile, once a costly luxury, became affordable to millions of families. This brought about many other changes in American society and the economy. The increased number of cars created a need for highways, gas stations, motels, and roadside diners. The oil industry grew rapidly because of the need for gasoline and motor oil. To meet the demand for cars, a system known as mass production was used. Mass production means making a large number of products quickly. Automaker Henry Ford used an assembly line to mass produce his cars. On an assembly line, a product is built as it moves past workers. Each person does one job, such as tightening a bolt. By 1925, one Ford came off the assembly line every 10 to 15 seconds. So as opposed to like one person building up a car, now they're just pumping them out every 10 to 15 seconds. It just kind of goes down the line and boom, boom, boom. So here is a picture of people working on an assembly line. They're actually making Model Ts, it looks like. I don't know, it doesn't say, but they're making cars on an assembly line. Okay, Age of Wonders. Modern household goods such as vacuum cleaners, electric stoves, and refrigerators were also mass-produced in the 1920s. Some homes had these new devices. Entertainment also changed, and new ways of reaching wide audiences were developed. These new medias included the radio and movies. So we talked a little bit about the fact that movies, were starting to be a thing with Thomas Edison. We had the whole inventors deal, but now they're becoming much more widely accessible to everybody. Most American homes had radios. People went to the movies in their free time. Movies also used to have news, like news reports before the movie, because they didn't have televisions. And so a lot of times, if you wanted to get the news reports, you either had to read a newspaper or you could go to the movie theater and they would have newsreels before the movie started. Buying on time. Magazines and radio advertisements persuaded people to buy new items. Many people who could not afford the items bought on credit. Consumers borrowed money to pay for goods, then paid it back over time. Some people, however, were unable to pay back the money they had borrowed. That would lead to economic problems by the end of the 1920s. Okay, so hard times. So the 1920s were exciting for many Americans. However, some of the worst discrimination in our nation's history occurred during this time. Immigration limits. Widespread prejudice towards immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe arose in the 1920s. This anti-immigration attitude led Congress to pass laws limiting immigration. In 1924, the National Origins Act ended almost all immigration to the U.S. for 40 years. This is kind of one of those things where you can, like, on the one hand, you might look at this and be like, oh, that's bad. You shouldn't tell people that they can't come into the United States. On the other hand, who were the United States fighting against? Well, Germany is kind of an Eastern Europe area, and then Austria-Hungary, kind of the same thing, and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, is sort of down there in that Southern Europe area, Italy there as well. And so consequently, Americans come back from fighting this war, and they say, hey, we don't like the people we were just fighting against. So we can look back at it now and think like, oh, that's so wrong to discriminate against people from from a certain area, and it is. But at the same time, try to understand that these guys have just spent years uh, fighting against the people that they're now discriminating against. So of course they're going to not like them. That I think almost goes without saying. Ku Klux Klan. The prejudice towards immigrants led to a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had threatened newly freed African Americans, but had been inactive since the late 1800s. In 1920, membership grew to more than 4 million. The Klan expanded the groups it targeted to include Jews, Catholics, and immigrants from Southern Europe. And then we have the economy crashes. By late 1929, the U.S. economy faced serious problems. Mass production had led to more goods than people needed. Also, many people were still paying for items they had purchased on credit. When people stopped buying, companies could not make profits. Many companies were owned by stockholders. A stock, this is one of your vocabulary words, is a share in the ownership of a company. People buy and sell stocks in the stock market, an organized system for buying and selling shares. Many people had also borrowed money to buy stocks. So the stock market was a way to make money. And so people would they would borrow money thinking that they could put it into the stock market because the stock market was just going up and up and up. So you put it into the stock market, buy some stocks, and then eventually your stocks have become so valuable that you can sell some of them to pay off the money that you borrowed and still have the other ones that are now making money for you or are becoming more and more valuable that you can sell to make money. That works great as long as the stock prices keep going up. As soon as they go down, it doesn't work so well. So during this time, profits were falling. Many stockholders decided to sell, but there were few buyers. Many stocks suddenly became almost worthless. People who had borrowed money to buy stocks could not repay their debt. On Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. This event began a period known as the Great Depression, a period of severe economic hardship in the 1930s. So yeah, basically, these stocks, their value is just what people will pay for them. But if you turn around and you're like, oh my gosh, this company is losing money, I'm going to sell my stocks, and you say, hey, who will buy this stock for $50? And nobody will buy it. Okay, well, who will buy it for 40? Nobody. 30? Nobody. 20? Nobody. 10? Nobody. $5, $2, $1. Who will buy it for $1? Well, that drives the value of the stocks down, of course, because it's not just like there's one or two or three stocks for a company. There's thousands upon thousands. That means everybody who had bought these stocks for $50 and now are trying to sell them for $1 or 50 cents or something like that, they have lost a massive amount of money. And consequently, the selling of those stocks means the company is getting less money coming into it. Essentially, a lot of companies own chunks of their own stocks, and so consequently now there's stocks that they would sell to help add money to their business. They can no longer sell, or at least can't sell it for very much. And so that if that happens to one or two companies, like, oh, okay, no big deal. But if it starts happening to lots of companies and to very big companies, that causes just an overall, people start to panic and start selling, and drives the value of everything down, basically, and to the point where the economy can really fall apart. And it's kind of a scary thing because the economy can fall apart based just on people being nervous. Now in this case, it was because these companies were actually starting to lose money. But at the same time, if you have a situation where people get scared and they start selling off their stocks for cheaper and cheaper prices, it can, even if the companies are doing okay, it can actually cause problems, which is sort of a weird thing. The stock market has, it's kind of a fascinating but almost a scary idea. For instance, a couple of years ago, there was a story that I don't remember which Super Bowl it was, but there was an upset in the Super Bowl, and then the next day, on that Monday, stock price, like the overall stock prices dropped significantly for some reason. Just I guess people were worried that the outcome of the Super Bowl might affect stock. I don't know. It was just a weird thing, but there's lots of things that can affect the value of stocks, and so it's kind of a scary thing. Okay. All right, so part D is a time of crisis. The stock market crash forced many banks to close. Companies went out of business. Even worse, unemployment skyrocketed. More than 1 in 4 workers became jobless. Many people lost their homes. Some people were forced to live in shacks and tents that were called Hoovervilles after the president in 1929, Herbert Hoover. So basically, people were mad at Hoover for not doing more to help them. And so as they are forced to basically live in a tent, and these tents are all kind of gathered together, and so they're towns, they call them Hoovervilles. By 1932, the nation faced the worst economic crisis in its history. Franklin D. Roosevelt won the presidency that year by promising Americans a New Deal. He said he would use the power of the U.S. government to put people to work. Roosevelt is obviously related to Theodore Roosevelt. They're not even cousins. They're distantly related. I think they're like fourth cousins or something like that, like pretty far separated. But they are still this Roosevelt line. In fact, I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt is married to, I think his wife is also related to Theodore Roosevelt, though again, distantly enough that it's not weird, but it's, they are related, they're like sixth or seventh cousins. So they're pretty spread out, but still, that's the thing. Anyway, the government steps in. In Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, Congress passed many laws that set up new agencies. They were called alphabet agencies due to their initials. Government programs hired workers to build dams in the West. These included the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River and the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River. So here is a picture of the Hoover Dam right there. And there's kind of like a little thing that shows all the different, or some of the New Deal programs. So, okay, there was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which is the CCC. That put people to work planting trees and fighting forest fires. There was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, so the AAA, which helped farmers get higher prices for their crops. Fun story, we have this economic depression. People are poor, they can't afford food. The federal government was buying crops from farmers and then destroying them because they wanted to make sure that prices were artificially raised, right? If there's fewer of a thing, then prices go up for it. So in order to keep food prices high, the federal government was destroying food while its own people were starving. That's a thing that happened. Federal Depot Insurance Corporation, which is the FDIC, that's one that's still around today. The other two probably are also around, but FDIC is one that you might hear about occasionally. But that insured banks and protected people's money. And the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, brought electricity to rural areas of Tennessee and bordering states. So those were some of the quote-unquote alphabet agencies that were created. Drought destroys farmland. The nation's economy was also hurt by a natural disaster. For several years, beginning in 1930, a severe drought dried out Midwestern farmlands. High winds blew away millions of acres of soil. This area became known as the Dust Bowl. Many farm families were forced to leave their land to seek jobs on the West Coast. If we were having class, I would have shown you a video about the Dust Bowl. It's pretty crazy. Did not hit Iowa. There's a picture here of where the Dust Bowl really affected things. So down here you've got Texas, Wyoming, Kansas, but Iowa, we're up here, so we're not too bad. Not that things were great for Iowa, but just, they weren't part of the Dust Bowl. Women play key roles. President Franklin Roosevelt had an important ally in his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. She traveled the country and reported conditions to him. France Perkins, the first woman to serve in a president's cabinet, also helped support the New Deal. As the Secretary of Labor, she fought to get Congress to pass two programs that are widely known today. One was Social Security, designed to help people after they retire. The other was unemployment insurance, which paid money for a certain period of time to people who were jobless. Okay, and so that is the end of this unit or this lesson. So I think that I mentioned it, but mass production, assembly line, and stock are your, it looks like those are your 3 vocabulary words that I remember reading. Oh, and suffrage. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one. Next one is World War II, so that'll be fun. But anyway, have a good day. Talk to you later.